Welcome to ExtremeNOW Virtual, streaming to you live on the topic of headless IoT, a salient topic during October's Cybersecurity Month. And in the spirit of Halloween, you could relate IoT as the ghost on your network. Why? Because there are more things connected to the network than there are people. 20.4 billion IoT devices will be connected this year. And by 2025, that number will skyrocket to 75 billion IoT devices. So the benefit of IoT in our digital age definitely outweigh the risk. In fact, 54% of enterprises attribute cost savings to the use of IoT. But this is a double-edged sword. Anything connected to your network that's looking, listening, or monitoring can be used for transformation, but can also be exploited for information. Here's a sobering fact. In 2019, Amazon sold over 100 million Alexa-enabled devices. The scary part? You may not know the scope of IoT devices on your network. And while you can exploit IoT by connecting to them, you can't manage them through a CLI or interface to control their behavior. Spooky, I know. So joining me today, Extreme Networks cybersecurity experts Perry Correll, Director of Product Marketing, and Ed Koehler, Senior Principal Software Applications Engineer and active member of InfraGard, alumni with Black Hat, and contributing author on Dark Reading. Hi, Ed, Perry, thank you both so much for joining me today. Are you a little spooked out? Because I am.
No, not at all. Looking forward to it.
Great. Awesome. Well, first I want to break down what exactly makes an IoT device headless. Ed, I'll start with you.
Oh, many times IoT devices come into an enterprise and nobody owns them. And there's no direct hierarchy management to those devices. Not only are they dark, but there's no centralized management or practices to their security. So many times these devices come in, and unless you
organizations that typically, want to leverage IoT will certainly employ them across different areas of their business. But how do you identify the scope of IoT devices on the network? Sometimes we don't even know that they're there.
That's a huge point, Erika, and I kind of want to go over something. Normally, you give it a lot of numbers and stuff. I think one of the good things to understand here is what is the impact? What's actually going out there? And I want to read some statistics recently from Forrester and even a little bit from the FBI. And just kind of interesting, 69% of people surveyed, these are CISOs, these are security people, so that half of the devices on their network are unmanaged IoT devices. And 30% say, I have 3 times as many unmanaged devices as I had managed devices. 67% actually have experienced a security incident, and honestly, it's probably higher than that. They're just not aware of some of them. 88% feel existing security protocols are not sufficient. Only 16% of enterprise security managers say they have adequate visibility into the IoT devices, something that you just brought up. All of them believe essentially that they're not spending enough money on the technology, and 93% of them say they plan to increase their spending on IoT in the next year. And the final point, and it kind of goes back to what Eric said at the very beginning, we're seeing a 30% growth per year on IoT devices. Now that's scary because we're already at the, pick a number, 20 billion point. Just think about 30% per year, what it's going to do.
By the end of 2021, there will be 10 times as many things on the network as there are people. And to give you a grasp of that situation, according to Ponemon Institute, 34.3 million IoT-based attacks in the 2019 timeframe. And here is an added dimension, and this is what I call the dark delta, is the fact that when you look to takes between 3 to 5 minutes to compromise a typical IoT device. And if it's hard-coded passwords and there's well-known backdoors, then it's probably even less than that. However, it often takes up to 6 months to discover that vulnerability. This becomes a very key dark delta, and that's a number that we need to reduce. And this is part of what I've been working on for quite a while now, and part of what Extreme intends to do in this area is to help reduce that area of vulnerability, because but I do want to emphasize also that humans don't get off scot-free. Yeah, so the practices have to be put in place. There's a lot that we have to do as far as humans within the IT, particularly the security operations space, to address this challenge. And I think with the appropriate tools, we can make that challenge reachable.
So
Ed, that's so important. Okay. No, I just want to code. That's so important because forever, your IT department is saying, hey, don't click on these phishing attacks and don't do those emails because, it's going to create you problem. But it's also don't bring this stuff into the network and not let IT know about it, because a lot of this equipment, as you call it, shadow IT, it's so easy to bring it in and put it on your desk, plug it up on the wall and whatever. And the IT department doesn't even know it's there. And I just made a portal into your network.
Yeah,
exactly. So my question is, you talked about the scope of impact, right? But how do we identify and catalog the scope of devices if shadow IT is being used, or if you're just not aware that you have certain devices that are a source of vulnerability? Cataloging those devices, what do we do, Ed?
There are three dimensions to that, really. Is obviously first get an asset list. Identify what's in your network. Oh, you brought an Alexa in from home, or you have some sort of Apple wristband or something that you're using over our Wi-Fi. Get an asset list. Understand what's on your network. Understand the purposes of it. Some of it is relatively easy to solve. Some of it has a little bit more complex questions that have to be asked. But once that's enumerated, the big secondary aspect of it is to get a vulnerability asset enumeration. So they understand the vulnerabilities of those systems in the network. So you not only know what's in your network and what it's for, but you'll also understand the associated vulnerabilities with that. And keep attention to the CVEs. Understand the Linux versions that are within these devices, and then understand which CVEs can relate to it. I mean, a great example is that when you look at some of these attacks that have happened, for instance, with the VxWorks vulnerabilities and the Linux vulnerabilities that have happened in the TCP stacks, many people are not really aware of the fact that they are directly attributed to their home gateways or their video surveillance cameras, because many times these devices have Linux systems underneath.
So I've got a question for you, Perry. Is IoT really confined to certain industries like manufacturing, utilities, logistics, transportation? These industries we know very intentionally leverage IoT. But what about the other industries, retail, healthcare, education? Do they also need to be aware of the scope? Because like you said, Ed, you're talking about a smartwatch that's actually connected to the Wi-Fi. So this must expand beyond, the typical industries that you'd expect, right, Perry?
No, absolutely. And, IoT, people say the Internet of Things, or, information and operational technology, or industrial, whatever you want to call it. It's across every industry. And it's important to understand that the biggest driver in my mind, or one of the biggest drivers of IoT, is efficiency. I've got all these widgets, for lack of a better thing, and some of them are very expensive and some are very cheap, but they're all designed to make things more efficient, whether it's temperatures, whether it's sensors, whatever it happens to be. And that works everywhere. I mean, that's agriculture and fields. That's obviously healthcare is huge right now. And healthcare is extremely challenging because Ed had mentioned before, everybody's into wearables, or everybody's into the different technology, and it's just so easy to do, and the technology keeps moving. It's moving faster than the security to protect it. So there is no vertical, there's no market, there's no area that doesn't actually have this. And one of the other things that's important to understand, and Ed kind of mentioned before, you think about what's happening in your house, and that's important to understand, because one of the big threats, and it's actually a recent FBI report or notice that came out, is your kids' toys. Internet-enabled toys that actually able to listen to and actually uplink this stuff into the cloud, and what the kid's name is saying, what school they go to, where they physically are. And so it kind of gives you an idea of, Big Brother's always listening at some point, whether it's Alexa or that fluffy teddy bear that learns your child's name and repeats it back. And if it's uplinked out, that's information that may be going somewhere. And the only way you can do that is be able to monitor that device and who it's talking to.
So
So
a big
scary
part of
toys.
this, Erica, is yeah, exactly. But a big part of this is awareness of what IoT is. And to add to Perry's comment, a lot of people aren't aware of the fact that a printer sitting in the corner of your office is an IoT device. The IP phone sitting on your desk, that's an IoT device. IP television, perhaps even the smart display television that you might have in a hotel room, that is an IoT device. Many of these systems have Linux underneath. Therefore, they are quite sophisticated in their core. Now, they may be limited as to their function and intended to be so, but it doesn't mean that someone with malicious intent could not take and make that system do something other than what it was intended to do. This is the big thing that most people miss about IoT. A video surveillance camera, for instance, you think, well, it's a video surveillance camera. I put it up, it gives a camera feed. I watch the camera feed on my web. I, can get it on my phone. But what you don't realize is that underneath you have very often a Linux OS system that can be compromised, can be instituted and used as a pivot point. Many times folks implement home gateways, and they implement them and they may change the password, but they fail to flush the default so that the default well-known password is still in that home gateway. And there are plenty of websites where you can go up and you can look at a vendor. So for instance, if I look and I'm able to identify the type of home gateway you have, I can go up to certain sites, identify that default password, try it, and many times that will succeed.
And that's kind of an important point that you just brought out. I just want to extend a little bit about what you're just saying, the home use. A lot of people don't realize that many of their smart TVs actually have a camera in them. And these things could be, they might not even know they exist in there, or think of in a hotel room, or think of any type of environment like that. That thing can be looking back if somebody else takes control of it. And obviously we don't want anyone want to go down that path.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but it's been known to occur. There have been known instances of, I'm sorry, Erica, but I just want to add to that there have been known instances of IP phones being turned into bugs, monitoring points, to actually listen to what's going on within an office or a conference room.
So I'm definitely more spooked out than I was when we first began this conversation. And I'm going to check out my TV to figure out if it's got a video camera on it. But obviously, these are the risks and the threats that we incur when we leverage innovation, when we leverage IoT for automation and workflows. And we depend on a lot of these devices day in, day out within our personal lives, and more within our professional, world and our operations, not just within manufacturing, but healthcare and retail, to really automate processes and reduce touch points, for example. But how do we protect against the IoT ghosts, if you will, on the network? I mean, 2019 WannaCry wreaked havoc in healthcare by hacking into the Windows operating system of the medical DICOM devices. So this is one of many examples of exploitations through IoT. What are the realities of the potential threats and vulnerabilities that organizations should be aware of so that they can protect against it? You guys mentioned a lot of those statistics from FBI and different stats that Ed, you've worked on. Tell me a little bit about the environments that you've helped support and how they've been able to protect against those threats.
Well, that's actually, and if you recall, I brought up 3 points. I only covered 2 in my initial talk. I kind of held back on that third, and this is actually an opportune time to talk about that. Fortunately for us, IoT devices are not incredibly extensive in their behavioral scope. And I'm going to use a couple different case point examples. An IP phone, for instance. You pick up, you make a call, there's a call to the SIP registrar, that sets up your peer-to-peer session. After that, you have your SRTP session for voice over IP. That's pretty much it. That's all the phone really should ever do. A video surveillance camera, it comes up, logs into the virtual management system for the video system, and then probably attaches to 1 or perhaps 2 digital video recorders. And beyond that, that's pretty much all that camera should ever do. Production floor, drive control systems, all of these are very narrow scopes in behavior, which means that they can be normalized. And what do we mean by normalization? What we mean is that if we monitor a device for enough time in this scope of behavior, given IoT or industrial control, we can actually find out what the normal behavior of that device is within its scope. And from there, we can create an owl list or a white list, which is very short typically. And it basically says, okay, out of the things that we know of your normalized behavior, you can do A, B, C, and D. And you are denied anything else. And that becomes the scope of authority that is, or the scope of trust that's assigned to that device. Now, just doing that is not sufficient, however. You have to have the visibility to see if the device attempts to do something otherwise. A great example is Mirai. Mirai did lateral propagation within IoT devices. Video surveillance was one of its favorite targets, but it used whatever it came across, printers, home gateways, whatever. And Mirai basically had this signature of propagation. So just because you're preventing a device from doing something doesn't mean that it should be ignored. So catching those anomalies is key. Now, this is the saving grace. Because of these narrow signature profiles, catching anomalies is very, very easy. When you compare that with an end user that might have gone bad for one reason or another, that's a bit more complex because humans tend to be very flexible in the way they think, and you really have to do a lot of investigation to find anomalies of human user behavior, i.e. someone that's gone rotten in the apple bin. Well, I'm an apple farmer, so I use that analogy. But IoT devices, it's very black and white. I mean, there are certain ranges of behavior, and if you discover what those ranges are and validate them, then if that device ever does anything different, it should be investigated.
Right.
And it probably is malicious.
No, and that's very curious that you say that, or interesting rather, because these devices are essentially being leveraged as a backdoor entry into the network. And so once that breach occurs, that's when the behavior of the device begins to shift from the normalized behavior that it should be conducting on the network. So Perry, how do we really capture the normalization of these devices to detect when there's an anomaly, when we can't log into the devices themselves?
Well, actually, I don't want to say that's easy, but it is easier than you actually would think it, because with some IoT devices that are generated by large organizations, a Siemens or a GE or something like that, you can actually get characteristics. Actually, there's an IoT organization that's looking to actually standardize that, and it would actually say this is what this device should do on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. But as Ed was kind of talking about before, you kind of have to, some of the stuff you have to deploy it in a way, and you want to containerize it. You don't just want to throw new products out there and see what happens, but you actually want to build a baseline, over days, weeks, months, or whatever. You're going to find out what's the normal behavior. If it's a thermostat on the wall, okay, great. It shouldn't move. It's nailed to the wall. So if I detect it's moving, either there's construction going on or somebody just stole it or whatever. It's going to generate, as he mentioned on an IP phone, it's going to generate a certain amount of SIP traffic. So if it's a thermostat, use that as again, and it's going to generate, maybe a couple 100K a month, sending temperatures to some type of send. If it starts generating more traffic or different types of traffic, or sending it to an overseas URL or whatever, obviously at that point something has to happen. So as he kind of hinted, the first thing you do is you get a new product, you bucketize it. It's a phone. This is kind of what it should do. It's a thermostat. This is kind of what it should. To TV. This is everything's going to be a little bit different. But then actually you monitor, you detect the anomaly, and then the biggest thing is once you detect something, to correct it. So, I mean, the easiest way, first thing, is quarantine it. Throw it on its own VLAN or ACL or do something to it, and then mitigate it. Find out, maybe it just broke. maybe it's not actually malicious, but it's just kind
That's
of
true. Not everything's
generating
malicious.
random.
Not
It,
everything's not
just
everything's a Jack Ryan novel, right?
Exactly.
Right,
But that's also important too, because time and distance is very, very important with that. If you have if each one of your sites is being managed individually versus having a cloud solution that looks at the entire site, I could see multiple, let's just say, benign events that occur and not worry about it. But if I'm seeing it at different sites, kind of there's some trending or timing and size, doesn't look bad, but something's happening and they're somehow tied together, and I've got to make some action associated with this until I figure out what's going on. So back to, I think the very first thing Ed said, you've got to see what's happening. You got to know what's on your network, and you got to see what's happening on your network, because that's the only way you can react to it.
And
right.
this
Ed,
is the way. Well, let me finish on that, because you asked me about customer use cases. This is the reason why this needed to be covered, because this is the other half of the equation that many of our customers have figured out, is that first of all, they contain the behaviors of the IoT devices. And we do that through segmentation. And you keep that, if I can use the term, puritanical. Okay, so you say, okay, video surveillance, okay, there's only digital video recorders, there's only IP cameras, and there's only the video management system. That's it. Nothing is ever on this segment. Same thing with the building management system. Same thing with, as Perry pointed out, HVAC, temperature control, things of that nature. Don't just take your IoT and lump it away from your user space and say, okay, the problem's solved. Remember, many of these botnets are designed to propagate, so they can propagate between systems. Remember, many of these systems have the commonality of Linux underneath. So separating the communities of interest is very key. The other thing is that you need to do analysis of whether a segment needs to really have connection back into the enterprise. Many people are married to this concept that I have to have some sort of pinhole into every single segment within my network. And that sometimes is flawed. And I ask people to really look at the IoT solution and determine, does it really need connectivity back into the enterprise IT environment? Or can that segment exist in an isolated state? Provided that there's other methods that you can do as far as pulling information out. A great example that I often use is video surveillance management. A security guard needs to get access to that system. They can do that through the web interface of the VMS. They don't necessarily have to be able to communicate directly to the DVRs or the video management of the cameras themselves. Typically, that should all be in an isolated segment. And that's the example I often use. But the important thing to realize is many of our production customers, manufacturing customers, have discovered the same thing, is that many times when they assume they have to have this open channel between the two environments, they discover that that's really not required.
One thing I want to add to that, Ed, one point I want to add to that I think is really, really important. And it's important to realize that the hackers, whether they happen to be some amateur or, criminal-based or state-based, most of the time they're not trying to hack into your most secure device. They're not trying to get into your server in the data center. That's the good thing and the bad thing about IoT, is that a lot of these devices are my access point, my entryway, because they're nothing. They're widgets. They're not important. But if I can get into that, I can get into the other stuff. So it's very, very important to realize that this little thing that you spent $20, $25 for might be the access point into the network, because a lot of times these guys are looking for what's going to let me in, not necessarily how I defeat 7 levels of security.
Now, I would like to actually combine that with, because I've been following Mirai. That's been the thing I've been watching, is the evolution of this. So when you look at what's been going on in that environment, it actually is kind of scary, because we are seeing the evolution of a botnet basically getting out into the public. And what happens, and we call that the wild. And when you look at that, the Chinese, the Russians, anybody sitting anywhere across the globe can really get access to this through something called the Tor, the dark web. And this code is now on a marketplace. You can purchase it, you can get kits, you can get support program for development, so that everyone can basically build their own botnet. And we're seeing a lot of, and the scary thing is we're seeing a lot of variations to this now. For instance, there is one called Maori. Maori is an evolution of Mirai, and basically what it does is it uses the Tor to do command and control to these IoT devices. So everything is happening now on the back end through the dark web, which is very anonymous and encrypted end to end. So it becomes very, very difficult to understand the communication of the command and control paths. So this is something that's kind of scary when you think about it, because if someone can get critical density in your environment and you can't even trace the fact that they have that presence, and there's a trigger that they can pull at any time that they wish, that's a very scary, scary proposition. So catching the anomalies and catching the differences in behavior early is really the key. And then having the appropriate segmentation, segment. This is what our customers have done. They've used our fabric technologies to segment the network out so that even if a certain IoT system set, let's say video surveillance, gets infected, it can't propagate. It can't propagate into the user space, and it becomes an incident, but it's not a catastrophe. There's a big difference.
Right. So if it's connected, protect it, period. You guys really walked through the workflow here, the best practices, which is first create a catalog and a scope of IoT devices on your network. Once you can catalog them, you know what type of normalized behavior they should be conducting on the network in order to detect those anomalies in case there is something suspicious or malicious occurring with that device as a backdoor entry into the network. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're segmenting to ensure that if a breach does occur, that we can leverage, say, with Extreme Fabric Connect technology, a stealth IP core would contain that breach to where it really can't wreak havoc on the rest of the network, and allows the IT administrator time to remove the threat if that were to happen. But how do we prevent the behavior from changing? I mean, we talked about IoT devices having very specific functions. So how do we enforce those functions to be applied, that they can only do certain things, like whitelist models, for example?
Yeah, we have a number of solutions in place. We have the IoT Defender series, both campus-based and also cloud-based solutions that can allow for that. But then also many of our switches have very, very high granular policies that we can institute at the edge. We can also provide that within the wireless space as well. The whole point is to get this translated into a series of context so that it can be put into a policy. The policy can be universal. It can be universal between a wireline versus a wireless device, depending on its personality. And in many instances, those policies can be instituted across multiple systems, with obviously the individual details being the port calls and things of that nature that are occurring. So this isn't rocket science. It's not rocket science. The key is to have an asset list, to have a known personality for that device, its normal range of behaviors, and then you institute policies that basically match to that normal range of behavior. We have some products that can actually do that, what we call a learning mode. IoT Defender is one of those that can actually sit back for, let's say, 2 weeks and watch an IoT device and gain the notion of, quote unquote, a signature or a fingerprint. And from there, we can develop a policy base.
One of the things that kind of goes along with that, I think it's important to understand that over the last 30 minutes, we've talked about IoT devices in the enterprise. And we've also talked at home. Well, what's just happened in the last 6 months? I guarantee you everybody sitting here listening to us right now are in their home office, they're in their living room, they're wherever they happen to be. And so that kind of changes things a lot. And it's very, very important to understand that, because not 6 months ago, you could have had 1,000 people in one building, and you could put a pretty good bubble around that building with very, very high security. Now I've got one person in 1,000 different locations, and yeah, they might be connecting in from their laptop versus a VPN, but depending on how protected that VPN is, you can have, I'm making this pipe that's going from your house into my enterprise, and how much security you have. One of the things you want to think about too is, instead of doing it that way, pushing security out to the edge. Ed mentioned a minute ago that there's a lot of intelligence and a lot of capabilities in our switches and APs. And you want to actually apply security as far out as possible. You don't want to bring everything to the core of your network and decide what's bad and you want to throw it away. So the ability to actually take your enterprise policies and your security policies and put that at, working from home in the home office, whether it's an AP, whether it's a switch or whatever, and apply those
right
policies
into the
at the
home
edge is
gateway.
huge.
Exactly. Right into the home gateway, because that's the biggest risk. Is many people have home gateways that are ancient. And they probably have never been upgraded. And now you have people that are using those devices to gain access to your environment. And if that home gateway has been somehow compromised, then there is a potential vulnerability at that. I don't want to say it's a blatant vulnerability because you still have some protections, but it's there. Excuse me. So that is an important consideration to make.
Great point, Perry, about mobility. And we're not all in the same place anymore. So that brings me to one of my final questions for you both, because I know you both are a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this topic, and you'll go on for much longer, right? Easily. But there's been an illusion of control between IT and OT, between the carpeted space, if you will, and the plant floor and the industrial side of the environment. Or now that we have all these mobile workers in industries that typically didn't have working from home as an option, to your point, Perry. So what's the gold standard going forward? We can't just air gap every environment between IT and OT. And what is effective now that everyone is mobile?
Well, that's a big part of it. And I think Perry touched on that, is that getting the home gateway presence is very, very key. And Extreme has a number of products that can actually provide that footprint, so that now an enterprise can extend out to the mobile worker, someone who is doing the teleworking, which is very appropriate to say that that's a good portion of us today. I myself am in my home office, and that's been something I've been doing since the beginning of this year. So the reality of it is that with products that we can provide a very small footprint, relatively low cost, you can put these devices in, no more than a home gateway that you get from any other vendor. But the point is you can tether back into the cloud, you can tether back into the enterprise using secure VPN connections. And now what happens is you have an administrative footprint into the home residence rather than some third-party gateway that they bought at Radio Shack or wherever. So that's an important dimension to add in the branch or the home networking scenario, the teleworking scenario. But now let me flip to the production floor. We have some huge manufacturers, some of them very sizable automotive manufacturers, that have realized the value of what we can do with our fabric technology on the production floor. Because once these identified devices have policies attributed to them, and segmentation and access control. Now what happens is IT has minimal involvement in production floor changes, the ability to change a flow. So for instance, maybe you have a new model of a car, or perhaps the same model, it's coming out with a different trim package. Well, that requires a different flow. And now, rather than getting IT involved and having a separate project involved, and you can imagine the costs associated with that, the production workers on the floor can rearrange, and the devices will be automatically identified, placed into their appropriate segments, and they can build the actual new flow on their own with minimal IT involvement. That is a huge savings.
Right. Right.
I think this comes back to... Go ahead, Erika.
What about the extension of services? You mentioned Fabric Connect. You mentioned how we can leverage Defender for IoT to really detect and understand what that behavior is, to create that normalization, and identify the anomalies when they occur. We can segment using Fabric Connect, but what about the extension of services, say for layer 2 or layer 3, and the multicast services that these IoT devices may be leveraging as they're mobile, because we're not keeping them in one room anymore. Say, a medical device has to be moved from one operating room to the next. Users are in multiple locations. So how do we prevent those services from, or apply policy enforcement without losing that secure segmentation as they move.
Sure.
No, that's a great
Well,
point. And as Ed was talking before about the whole fabric idea, the fabric is dynamic. And it actually moves with the individual. The policy, the capability, the security moves with them. You know, it's not correct to actually say it's kind of like a VLAN on steroids, but in a way it was. You know, when VLANs first came out 15, 20 years ago, the whole idea is I didn't have to reconfigure the whole network just because people moved or were in different places. But I can do the same thing. I can have devices and I can have systems and I can have people. As they move to different areas, their rights and their functionality come with them. And I keep isolated, whatever room I happen to be or whatever location I have to be at that point. And I can't emphasize enough, because that's where we keep going back to, and Ed was just talking about on the production floor and stuff. Any large enterprise is going to have multiple environments, you know, Wi-Fi, let's just say that. I'm going to have a guest network for something, but I want to make sure that's isolated, completely isolated, you know, digital air gap or however you want to do it from the production network, because you got to be 100% honest. You will be attacked. There will be threats. People will probably get into your network at some level. And you need to make sure that if they do get in, you still contain them. The damage they can do is always limited.
Well put.
Ed, can you expand a little bit on digital air gap?
Yes. The term air gap is often used in security, and many people think that's the ultimate nature. And quite frankly, there are some military applications of it that I've seen that are very well done. But when usually, as it's taken out into the common world, people take the notion of air gaps and they take some false notions of what it really means. So physical air gaps mean that you have separate network overlays. So perhaps I have a network for video surveillance. I have a network for my gaming banks. I have a network for my IT. I have a network for my PCI. And by the way, many casinos used to operate in that type of environment due to federal regulations and also security. Now, that's fine, but the problem is if you're really going to realize the notion of a true air gap network, then you have to have separate wiring closets for all of those. So think about, you know, where you've got 6 or 7 segments that you've got air gapped. Now you have to have 6 or 7 different wiring closets because you can't have physical co-location of air gap networks. So that becomes very, very costly. And it takes a big geographical footprint from a real estate perspective in order to accomplish that. The notion of air gap or digital air gaps is to utilize the networking technology, to utilize the virtue of the segmentation technology to provide those gaps, and they can be located on the very same switching architecture. And that's a big notional difference. And actually, it can actually complement the security because this touches on the notion of elasticity. So let's say I have IoT component A, and it needs to talk to resources A. Well, now I have the network, and it authenticates into the network through the use of our policy control. And now I can extend that resource. The notion of elasticity extends from the fabric out to the end device. And now I have that extension of that service network based on that policy. Now, if that device moves, let's say it's wireless, or perhaps someone unplugs it, moves it to another location, as in the case of what you used with like a rolling cart in a hospital. Once that becomes disconnected and the device A moves to a different part of the geographical topology, it connects back into the network, re-authenticates, and that same secure domain is extended back out. And that's what we refer to as the notion of elasticity. But note what happens here is this first port, that has been torn down, okay, because device A is no longer there. If I am moving to any point within the network, the first thing I am given is a null VLAN. And basically, the only thing that allows me to do is talk to the enforcement point, which is the switch itself. If I can pass the authentication gate, then I have this notion of elasticity. If I fail, then the port remains in a null state, and I error out back to the IT.
That really is what I was trying to understand, is that the service elasticity of those ports that the devices are connected to, even wirelessly connected, right? How do we make sure that somebody can't go and unplug a device, plug in their laptop, and leverage the same security policy that's authenticating the device that was connected to it. So that actually really rounds out the whole notion of segmentation for me in this scenario, that we're isolating through a digital air gap with virtual service networks that are completely encapsulating the traffic of that said device function, right? Whatever the IoT device may be, and elastically applying the services so that we can enable mobility, true mobility, without the risk.
It becomes effortless. It becomes truly effortless. I mean, if you have the framework established, many of these manufacturers have these production floors. They're templated out. So now, anytime they want to spin up a new flow, no problem. I don't have to get a hold of IT. I have, Joe, Phil, and Phyllis, and Sally, and they're going to go out and they're all blue-collar workers, but they understand what it takes. They understand the production floor manufacturing environment. They don't have to understand anything about IT. They don't have to understand anything. The only thing they need to know is that there's a switch going to be at my floor location. I plug my device in, I test it, validate it, it communicates to command and control, and boom, we go off. They don't have to understand anything else. So now what happens is I can take people who have the expertise with the subsystems they're dealing with, and I don't need to tie in IT in at every single step that the operational technology people do. And I think there's some really, really big financial benefits to that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to wrap this all up where we started from, we're going back to IoT and we're talking about the fabric and all that stuff. So if I've got a device, an IoT device, any device, and it's tied in with the fabric and it's got its own dedicated isolated link, it's almost impossible for that device to be infected if it's set up correctly. On the other hand, if I've got a device that I bring in that's infected already and I plug it into it and it gets onto an isolated network, it's got a dead end. I'm monitoring what it's generating, but it can't just propagate throughout the environment because I've isolated, I've segmented it, I've got a level of control. You're never going to have 100%, but you got to shoot for that.
Well, it allows you a layered defense. I realize that's an overused term, but I'd like to use I'm a military historian, so I'd like to use an example is that, when you looked at a medieval castle, you had the walls, but around that you obviously had the moat. But a lot of people don't understand what ramparts are. Ramparts are basically ramps of earth that had wooden palisades, and they had concentric circles of these around the castle. And the theory was that you didn't necessarily stand there and try to fight them on the field. You let the invader come in, and they came in through these narrow causeways. That's what causeways were. By the way, you were up on the ramparts, and you were able to shoot your arrows down, and basically you were retreating. You retreated back into the castle, but by the time your invading force got to the castle walls, they lost probably 2/3 of their force. Now a long-range siege isn't so attractive anymore. And this is basically a strategy that was leveraged quite well. Now, the way I translate that is what Perry talked about, is you can have an invader in your network, but I'll be honest with you, very seldom does even the most advanced persistent threat coming from nation states end up where they target. They usually will compromise an IoT device, a user, some sort of edge device, and then they will propagate and pivot from there. And eventually they'll get to their targets. But the point is they want to be stealth, they want to be dark. So if you can prevent their lateral movements or get it to the point where they have to make noise, they have to demonstrate anomalies and behaviors, well, you got to lead in the game.
Absolutely. I don't think I could have said it better to close it out. We got best practices on securing IoT in your environment and a military history lesson from Ed Koehler and Perry Correll. Very well done. Thank you both so much for the information. If you want to learn more about how Extreme can enable your organization to protect against the threats and minimize risk introduced with IoT, check out our latest webinar, Rethinking the Network and Security in the Era of IoT and COVID-19, available on extremenetworks.com/resources. Thank you for watching ExtremeNOW Virtual. Until next time, I'll see you then.